Today I'm going to run you guys through my Panasonic GH5 settings for cinematic looking video, and keep in mind these are just my settings. You're looking at the footage right now. If you want to achieve a look similar to mine, then you can follow these settings. If you have your own settings that you like, then that is totally fine. This is just my settings as requested by a bunch of viewers of my channel. So I've reset the camera settings to default so we can go through this from the very top. Let's start by basically checking your AF/AE lock. You'll see I have mine on manual focus. I always shoot manual focus. The autofocus on the GH5 is not great even with the new update. I love manual focus. I leave it on that at all times. And right now the wheel menu that I'm on at the top is, I switched it right now to custom 1. Now let's click the menu button here and do my first thing. You'll see system frequency is set to 59.9. I want to switch this to 24 Hertz cinema mode. That is the mode that I shoot in. I find it looks the most cinematic. So I'm going to do that and turn the camera off as it says, and then turn it back on. And now we've switched to 24 Hertz cinema mode. And now we're going to start to go through some of the other settings. So what I do, I set up three custom profiles that I shoot in using C1, C2, and C3 on the top dial right here. So the first one we're going to do, I want to make sure that my exposure mode is on manual. That's always how I leave it. And now we're going to go here and we're going to decide, we're going to make this our 4K 60 frame per second preset. So this is the mode I shoot in most of the time to get cinematic B-roll. So pick this setting right here. It's the first one after 1080p, and we're going to click that, and then we're going to go back up here to the variable frame rate, and we're going to set it to 60% right there. Boom. And there we go. That's a good start for this profile. So we've got 60 frames per second at 4K. And you'll see that I also have my SS gain operation set to angle ISO. What this is my shutter speed. What it means is instead of setting my shutter speed each time I change modes, I just leave it on 180 degrees. So if I'm shooting at, let's say, 60 frames per second, it means that my shutter speed automatically will be double that if it's on 180 degrees. So 60 frames a second, the shutter speed will be 120. If I'm shooting 24 frames a second, it will be around a 50. Shutter speed will be around 50. So it just makes our job a lot easier. So set your SS gain operation to angle and leave it at 180 if you want shots that look like mine. And then let's just scroll through this menu, make sure everything's good. I keep the master pedestal level at 0. And then in this menu, I use the record format MOV. It's just my personal favorite. Sometimes I've also shot in MP4. To be honest, there's not much of a difference between any of these modes. See how they play back on your computer. But if you're on a Mac, it should be totally fine to use any of these modes. MOV. And then let's keep going down. Photo style. This is very important to make sure you can get the most out of your image. And you'll see my link to my 100 GH5 presets below. If you're using the presets, I would recommend using the same settings that I have here. So I'm on Sin Like D mode in photo style, and then I have contrast at -1, sharpness at -5, noise reduction at 0, saturation -1, and hue at 0. And we'll click set. And we're going to keep that photo style consistent through all of our 3 presets. Let's keep scrolling down. Luminance level, I leave at 16 to 255. Metering mode, I leave it on the default one. Then highlight and shadow, I leave that. You don't want to mess with any of these settings. You basically want to give yourself the most amount of play in post-production as possible. I put the eye dynamic at low, eye resolution off. And keep scrolling down here. Nothing we need to adjust. That all looks good. And then what we can do is go into exposure. So ISO increments, we want these set to 1/3 EV instead of 1 EV. Basically, that allows us to up our ISO in smaller increments. So where it would jump, let's say from 400 right to 500, or 400 to 600, it only goes 400 to 500. And it just gives us a bit more play. So yeah, set your ISO increments to 1/3. Extended ISO, it doesn't really matter because I'm not going to crank it above 1600 anyways. AE lock, that doesn't really matter anyways because I'm shooting manual. Let's keep scrolling down here. Eye sensor, this is the most annoying thing when you wave anything in front of this eye sensor here and your screen goes dark. I don't like that at all. So I have that set to off. And we'll keep scrolling down here. And then this is my favorite, manual focused assist mode. And it just zooms in. So anytime I turn my focus wheel on my lens, it basically zooms in close. So before I start recording, I can basically focus up on the subject. And then when I half press the shutter, it comes out and I make sure that everything's in focus. So I would recommend manual focus assist set to this one right here, the second one down, and then assist display on full. And we'll keep rolling down here. This is what I love about the GH5. There's just so many custom settings that you can have. So I feel pretty lucky to have this camera. Peaking is a huge one. Basically, I set my peaking and I set it to high. You can choose your display color. Green or blue is pretty common. And what that is for focus. When I go focus on something, it will turn green on my screen when I am focused on something. So if it's someone's face, what peaking does is turn it green. Anything that's in focus will turn green or blue depending on what color you're using. And I put detect level on high. And we'll go back here. Histogram, I always have my histogram on. You'll see it in the top corner here. You can drag it around wherever you want. Basically, it just lets me know how exposed my image is and how evenly exposed. As you can see now, it's very underexposed. Everything is way too far left. You want it evenly spread out between the left and the right. But I always have this on my screen. Very helpful way to nail exposure. So histogram on. Guideline, I just liked having the grid on there at all times. And then the center marker, I have that off. Highlight off. Zebra patterns, this is for when I overexpose something. So let's say I go crazy here. You see these lines on the camera, or maybe it's a bit too bright. Let me lower it down. Basically, anytime something gets overexposed, these zebra stripes are going to come up on the area that's exposed. So if this whole upper half is overexposed, the lines show up and let me know that. So I would highly recommend turning your zebra pattern on and setting it. I set mine to either 100 or 95%, and then basically just select which one you want to use. And that is a very helpful exposure tool. Highly, highly, highly recommend that one. And we'll scroll down, exposure meter on. That's just a little bit down in the bottom there. I don't use that very often, to be honest. Manual focus guide, I always leave that on. Monitor info display, leave that on. So you can just get as much info as you can. And keep scrolling down. Video priority display, put that on. And that should be it for those settings. Now we can go down here and double slot function. So the GH5 has 2 slots for SD cards. I put my recording method to backup. So if I put 2 cards in, it records the same thing, but to 2 separate cards. Safe way to do it. If you want to switch that, you easily can and have them record one at a time. But this is a safe way to store your footage. Make sure you don't lose anything. So I like that mode a lot. And what else do we have here? And then now we're going to want to set this. So this, I'm on C1. My top wheel up here is on custom 1. And I want to basically overwrite it. So these settings are saved as my 4K 60 frames per second custom. So I can just switch the wheel to this at any time and I will get these settings. So now we have our 4K at 60 frames per second set up and ready to go. Now let's switch to C2, and I'm gonna make this my, basically I want this to be my 24 frames per second for when I want any audio, and all the settings that we just did will be the same in terms of, exposure mode, manual, and all that. But I'm going to go over here and change the record quality to what I want, which will be, I could shoot in 10-bit. Personally, I don't really need to. I know some people will be really mad to hear that. Why aren't you maxing out the camera? I'm a bit of a run and gun filmmaker, very happy with the results that I get. So I'm just going to leave it on this mode and then just make sure that variable frame rate is off. And now this way, this is going to be if I want to shoot an interview with someone, I'm just going to switch it to this 24 frames per second mode and leave it on that. And now what we want to do is save this setting. So custom memory set, save it as C2, like that. Overwrite current settings for custom 2, yes. So now basically, if I want my slow-mo settings, boof, I switch it to C2 and we're at 60 frames per second in 24 cinema mode. And then if I want to quickly do an interview with someone, I'll switch to 24 frames per second with audio. And now for C3, I can do a super slow motion setting, which I rarely use, to be quite honest with you. I don't use the slow motion 1080p, like 120 frames per second too often, but let's just have it set up because I know some of you probably will want to do that. So we'll go down to this setting right here and we'll click it, boom. And then we'll go up to variable frame rate, set it, and 120. And you might be wondering why not go all the way up to 180. You start to lose sharpness. You lose a lot of sharpness as you add a higher frame rate. So I would cap it at 120, but do whatever you want to for slow motion and click it there. Again, all our other settings have been saved. And now what we need to do is go down to custom memory and save this as our C3 1. Save it, boom, done. And there we have it. We have our 3 settings for the GH5, all good to go. And basically when I'm out in the field, I'm shooting in 60 frames per second for all of my B-roll, slow motion, beautiful cinematic stuff. And then if I need to do an interview with an artist, I'll quickly just swap over to this mode, C2, where I have my 4K at 24 frames per second, and I'm going to capture audio that way. And then I have my C3 for insanely slow motion footage if I want to do that 1080p at 120. For the C2 mode, when I'm recording interviews, sometimes I do go to mic level adjust depending on the microphone I'm using, and I turn it down if I'm using a lav mic. So that's a helpful setting to use at times. And then the final thing for stabilization within the camera. For the stabilizer, a lot of the time I'm using Canon lenses with the metabones, so I actually can't control what my settings are for the stabilizer. I just have to let the camera do that for me. So if you're using native lenses, it will be slightly different. For me, I just leave it how the camera lets me use it, and I seem to get a pretty amazing result. So that is pretty much the gist of how I set up my GH5 for filmmaking. If there's anything I missed, and I'm sure some of you in the comments below will be like, why the hell don't you use 10-bit and some other preferences that you guys might have? I get it. Everyone has different preferences. These are just my settings, the way that I like them. I'm not saying it's the only way to set up the GH5, but if you want results similar to mine, this is how I set it up. Check out my 100 GH5 LUT pack in the description below if you want to add some presets to your films. And yeah, leave a comment below what you thought and some films that you would like to see me do in the future. And I will see you guys in the next video.